When we were kids, we were told that we can be anything. And it seemed like we can. The possibilities are endless. You could be a doctor, a lawyer, a police officer, a scientist, a teacher, you name it. And according to a study, being a YouTuber is the most popular job among kids. Yes, you can be a YouTuber too. But somewhere along the way, we were hit with a dose of reality. We can be anything, but not everything. We need to pick something and stick to it. Many of these careers take years to train, and it's not possible to redo your life if you realize that you have picked the wrong career. Sure, you can change careers, but you'll need to take time to train for the new career. There's only so much time over a lifetime that you can use to change careers. With that in mind, this was never a problem for Ferdinand Demara. He's known as the great imposter who rose to fame in the 50s, due to his unusual skills. Here is Fred Demara's story. In 1921, a little boy called Fred was born in Massachusetts. He had a habit of playing tricks on people. You think he would find a career as a magician, but no, that's not what happened to him. As a kid, Fred even managed to trick a candy shop owner to give him free chocolate. Fred's father worked as a projection operator at the time. If you don't know what's a projection operator, well, it's the person who was responsible for operating the projector for movies and films. His father's job meant Fred was constantly exposed to pictures of actors and movie stars. He got acquainted with various characters in these movies growing up, which may have inspired him to adopt different characters later on. When Fred turned 16, he ran away from home to join a monastery. There, he became a monk. About 4 years later, at the age of 20, Fred left the monastery and joined the army. Army life was too tough for Fred, and soon, he began looking for a way out of the army. However, it was too late. He had signed all the documents. That's when he spotted an opportunity. Fred had a friend at the army called Anthony Ignolia. Fred would use Anthony's identity to switch over to the Navy. While at the Navy, Fred went through university catalogs and read the credentials of the professors listed in the catalogs. Fred would use this knowledge to understand what degrees and credentials one would need to get to where they are in their career. Fred found a teacher called Dr. Robert Linton French from the catalog. Dr. French was a researcher at Yale University at the time. Fred read through the credentials of Dr. French and began collecting the documents he would need to steal Dr. French's identity. The documents that Fred had gathered included a birth certificate, marriage license, and all the degrees that Dr. French had actually obtained. It's not clear how Fred managed to get a hold of these documents, but he may have forged them with the information that he gathered. With these credentials obtained, Fred went on to study philosophy and ethics. Yes, ethics. Fred actually did excel at these disciplines and managed to get a job as a psychology professor at a university in Erie, Pennsylvania, after he was done with his studies. Since Fred got into the programs under Dr. French's name, he had no choice but to continue wearing Dr. French's name when entering his new career. At this point, Fred had been a monk, a soldier, a Navy officer, a university student, and a psychology professor. Soon, he became bored with his new career, so he left Erie for Los Angeles. There, he worked as a medical assistant at a sanitarium. It is here that Fred gained a lot of medical knowledge that he would use to his benefit later on. Fred worked at the sanitarium for a while, before realizing once again that this wasn't the job for him. Fred handed in his resignation letter and moved to Washington State, where he started teaching psychology again, but this time at St. Martin's University. Fred persisted at this job longer than he did any other job. He actually was considering settling down for good, but of course, that wasn't what happened. Fred had made a major mistake while in Washington. He befriended a sheriff by the name of Frank Tamblyn. It's unknown whether the police were already onto him before Fred befriended Frank Tamblyn, or if it was just a coincidence. But the police did a thorough investigation on Fred, even though he was a close friend. One day, Frank knocked on Fred's door, and sensing that something was off, Fred initially refused to open the door. It took some coaxing for Fred to reluctantly admit that he was home. Fred opened the door, and Frank placed a handcuff on Fred. Frank didn't even have to say anything, because Fred already knew what he was guilty of. Fred Demara was sentenced to 18 months at the San Pedro prison in California. He served his term and got out. Frank was not able to assume any new identities while in the prison. Maybe because he learned his lesson. No. Once he got out, he went right back at it again. This time, his new identity was Dr. Cecil Hammond, who was a biologist from Kentucky at the time. Under Dr. Hammond's name, Frank got a job as a research biologist at a hospital that was affiliated with Harvard. After a while, the fake Dr. Cecil had enough and decided that he was done with being a biologist. It's extraordinary that he was able to pretend to know everything when he likely had no clue what was going on. Biology is a field rife with difficult terminologies that are easy to mess up. How he did it, we'll never know. Fred's next destination was Maine, and then it was Canada. It was in Canada that Fred took up an interest in theology, and he began working towards another degree in theology. During his time in Canada, while studying theology, Fred met and befriended Dr. Joseph Sear. Dr. Joseph Sear wanted Fred to help him get an American medical license. He only had a Canadian medical license, since he only studied and practiced in Canada. Fred was eager to jump on the opportunity, so he happily agreed. Dr. Joseph Sear gave a copy of all of his qualifications and diplomas, so Fred could get them processed in America. After Fred took the documents, he enrolled in the Navy as a surgeon for the Canadian Army. In the spring of 1951, Fred, under the guise of Dr. Joseph Sear, was called to Korea on a military ship called Kyuga. While Fred was on the ship, he was assigned to take care of minor treatments on soldiers. Since Fred had some medical knowledge from the time he worked as a medical assistant at the sanitarium, he knew what he was doing. At least some of the time. After Fred landed in Korea, however, he was faced with a lot more problems than a few routine medical treatments on soldiers. Before long, he was called in to treat a soldier with a bullet wound to the chest. Fred did not panic at the sight as you would expect. Under the watchful gaze of multiple soldiers, Fred managed to save the soldier. It was the first surgery that Fred ever performed. This act was enough to further convince Fred's team that he was who he said he was. Although they never questioned his identity in the first place. Fred became quite a well-loved figure in Korea, due to his charity work and excellent medical practice. Fred's multiple successful surgeries made its way into newspapers back home, and that's when the real Dr. Sear realized what had happened to his documents. It was a shock to learn of the many achievements that he has done in Korea when he never left the country. Dr. Sear called the authority, and an investigation was underway. The captain was forced to send Fred back home. Although, the captain was quite reluctant to do so, since they were losing a very capable surgeon on the team. It's reported that the captain apparently did not believe the authority when informed of Fred's fraud. He was under the assumption that it was just a mixed-up, and that they'll return Dr. Sear once they were done investigating. How wrong was he? Fred Demara's identity was finally uncovered when he returned to Canada. It was here that his other identities in the past were also uncovered. The Canadian authorities deported Fred back to America. It was difficult, because although Fred had lied about who he was, he did actually save those lives. But everything he's done in his career was for nothing. If it was actually his career, that is. Fred returned to his parents' house, penniless and depressed. Out of desperation, Fred agreed to do an interview for Life magazine about his fraud. He wanted to apologize for what he's done and redeem himself in some ways. The interview was done, and the headline of the article was, "The Fake Navy Doctor." Fred was able to get a few temporary jobs to help him pay the bills. Yes, he used his real identity this time. In 1955, when Fred was about 34 years old, he moved to Texas. He checked in under the name Dr. Benjamin Jones. There in Texas, Fred assumed the role of a professor and then, later on, a prison guard. Fred actually pulled off quite a neat trick when getting the job as a prison guard. He knew it wouldn't be easy. So, He sent his application to the wrong department on purpose, and they forwarded his application to the right department. This may have led the correct department to assume this certain Dr. Jones was specially referred by someone in the other department, so the job was his for the taking. Fred had actually excelled at all the jobs he had before becoming a lieutenant of the prison guards, and like the previous jobs he excelled as a lieutenant as well. In fact, Fred had done so well that he was promoted to become deputy warden. Just when Fred was getting comfortable with his new life as a lieutenant, he was recognized by one of the prisoners where he worked. Fred may have gotten a heads up about being discovered because he fled before he was apprehended. 1 year later, in 1956, the 35-year-old Fred returned to Maine as an English and Latin teacher. His new identity, Martin Godgart, was adopted seamlessly. But one of the kids' parents recognized Fred from the TV and took matters into her own hands. She gave Fred a drink of water, and when Fred put the glass down, she collected it and sent it off to the FBI. On February 14, 1957, Fred Demara was taken to jail. Fred was convicted of his crime and sentenced to, get this, 2 months probationary period. The sentence was for teaching without a license. At this point, Fred had already gotten caught twice. He realized that he had become too well known to keep pulling the same trick again without major consequences. Fred was also having a lot more health problems at this point in his life, so he knew he wouldn't be able to run if he needed to. In his later life, Fred was a chaplain at a hospital in California, where he had a quiet life. You may wonder how Fred managed to pull everything off. While we don't know everything, we do know that this happened during the time when the internet wasn't around. So it wasn't as easy to search up someone's name and what they looked like by Googling it. You would have to obtain a book that hopefully has the person's pictures and credentials to know whether they were the person they claimed they were. So, there were probably a lot more cases of identity theft before the era of the internet. We don't know why Fred Demara spent so many years assuming different people's identities. Maybe he just couldn't decide which career to pursue. Or more likely, he just liked the adrenaline rush of living on the edge. The rush of going to work every day and not knowing whether this is the day he went on a run. It may have excited him to live a double life. To work with people and get close to people, while not letting anyone know who he actually was. Fred had revealed in his biography that it was about grabbing loose and used power lying about. Maybe Fred liked outsmarting people when they weren't expecting it. It gave him a sense of control, and perhaps it was a way for him to challenge rules and laws set in place to govern everyone's lives, including his. What do you think? Leave your thoughts in the comments. Thank you for watching.